So this is our first night. We're going to talk about world religions and even the history of world religions. Well, you know I can't talk about a thing without talking about the history of it. But as I was talking about, and it's kind of funny when you start looking at these different religions and we look at the way they are now, and that's nothing like how they started. If you were to look at Judaism, for example, now, and the things we think we know about Judaism, even during the time of Jesus, but then you look back to where it all started, and it doesn't look anything, I mean anything, like the way it is now. It started off with, well, here's a little, I'll just throw this one out there to you. I always like to start you off with a shock. In the earliest forms of Judaism, the Hebrew religion, before it was even called Judaism, in the earliest form, there was God, but God had a female counterpart named Asherah. And for a long time, those two were consorts with each other. Now, we know in Greek mythology, for example, you have Zeus, who's the king of the gods, and the queen of the gods was Hera. You know that in Hinduism, there's Shiva and his consort Kali. The Norse god Odin and Freya, I think, was his wife. So you had all these different ones. Well, early Hebrew religion was much the same way. And eventually, all of that started to fade away. But before we get there, there are things that we want to talk about how these religions started to arise. I'll never forget a class I had on the history of, actually the class was called Comparative Religions. And the professor said, never forget that Christianity was born in the lush river valley of the Jordan, and Islam was born in the harsh, unforgiving desert of Saudi Arabia. He said, and that is really all you need to know. Well, he said, now, we're going to be talking for the next 4 months on this topic, but keep that in mind. Well, it's absolutely right. The environment that they're raised in, these religions are raised in, it shapes their theology. It shapes the way they look at the world. It shapes the way they look at their gods, if they have gods. Well, I want to step back beyond that. When did religion even start? We weren't always religious. I mean, I'm talking about way back. I'm talking about when there were Neanderthals, when there are certain things that we can look at, but actually we have to wait until our brain has developed certain things. Unless you want to go completely with the Adam and Eve story, that Adam and Eve were completely conscious, thinking the way we do now and all like that, then okay. But if we remember that Adam and Eve are symbols and they are legends and myths, then we have to look at this in a different way. Humans have developed over a long period of time. Our brains developed. There's actually 3 parts of our brain that we talk about. There's the what they call the reptilian brain, which is the most basic instincts. Then came the limbic system, and that's where things like joy and fear and stuff like that is love even, is inside there. And in the limbic system, it's something that still is affected in us. Like, for example, there are things that happen to us at an early age that wind up getting kind of stuck in the limbic system. And even though we know better as we get over, even though our experiences has changed, there are still things that will tap into that limbic system and will cause kind of a unconscious or irrational reaction in us. I'll never forget when I started teaching in middle school. I wasn't in middle school teaching. I was teaching kids who were in middle school. That there was a teacher there, and She was still on the faculty there. And she walked by me, and I caught a whiff of her perfume. White Shoulders perfume. All right, I don't have anything against that, but that's what she always wore. And she walked by me, and I am not kidding you, I got sweaty palms, and all I could think about was her barking at me because I hadn't conjugated some verb correctly or something. And I was like, holy cow, here I am. I was 28 years old, 27 years old, something like that. And I'm sweaty palms. I could take that old hag. I don't need to be scared of her. But the reaction was something that had set in my brain as a child, and it was still there. Now, the funny thing is, I could be around other people who have white shoulders on, and that doesn't bother me. Something about her and that perfume and some mixture of her chemistry, I guess. Anyway, things like that set in us. There are things that happen to us that it could be things like, to other people doesn't mean anything, but it reacts with our own unique memories and things that have been long since embedded in us. There are certain things that are embedded in us when we're being held by a parent or a grandparent or something like that. And when something recreates that situation, we have that nice feeling again. I will always think about my grandfather. He loved Dr. Pepper and moon pie. Those things. He wound up being diabetic, and he couldn't have it anymore. So he would always get them for me. And the fact is, I didn't really like moon pies. But he would always buy me one, and so I'd eat it and everything like that. And he just kind of was living vicariously through me. Well, I had a moon pie 4 decades later, and I was like, oh man, I kind of like that. But I realized I didn't like the moon pie. I liked the association of my grandfather with it. So, and then there comes the last stage of development in the brain. It's the neocortex, it's called. And that's where things like language and symbolism and planning ahead, all those things are there. And that's what we had to wait for, is to get that. Because if we're talking about religion, you have to talk about symbolism. If you're talking about language even, you're talking about symbolism. Words are symbols of other things, and writing is certainly a symbol of something else. Okay, so when we're talking about religion, we're talking about some belief system that is concerning the supernatural, the sacred, the divine, and as importantly as all that, moral codes, ethics, certain practices, certain values, certain institutions that kind of come along with that. But the sociologist Emil Durkheim said, that's not completely true. There are religious systems that don't have any connection to a God. And he's right. There are certain beliefs, and you don't have to think about a word like atheism or agnosticism. There are certain religions, I think specifically of Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't believe in a God. It doesn't believe, we always think that the Buddha was a God. Absolutely not. In fact, they believed that you should divorce yourself, you should separate yourself from connection to anything. In Buddhism, and we'll talk about this in detail when we get there, but in Buddhism, it's the attachment to anything that causes suffering. In fact, one Buddhist monk, there was a famous book that came out based on this idea, was, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Well, of course, they're not telling you that, but they're saying to have such a disassociation, such a non-attachment, even to the Buddha, that's what we have to do in this life. Otherwise, they believe, we're caught in this constant wheel of being reincarnated over and over again. So the Buddhists don't believe in that. In fact, what they really want is for existence to just end, so that I'm not reborn in another life, my existence ends. They call it nirvana. Nirvana really just means blissful annihilation. It's kind of like a candle being blown out. Now, they describe the transfer of, a reincarnation is that it's like passing a flame from one candle to another. Is it the same person? No, not really. It's just the same consciousness or life force that gets passed from candle to candle for who knows how many hundreds or thousands of years. And what they really want is for the candle to be blown out so that there's no more transfer, so that life ends, that existence ends. But they believe that you become part of like a universal consciousness at that point. Well, if you start talking to a Westerner, we're going to go, yeah, that's God. And of course, the Buddhists are going to go, no, it's not. It's not the same thing. Okay, all right. Well, it's like Wittgenstein said somewhere in the beginning of the 1900s. He said, religion and philosophy is just this, arguing words. Well, that seems a little simplistic to us, but he was right. That's what religion does, is we argue about words and the meanings of words and how this thing we might call something and somebody else calls it something else, but it's all just semantics. Well, so we wind up having this kind of an evolutionary beginning of religious behavior, and that evolution of religion, which is a field of study, and it's fascinating, it's related to evolutionary psychology and the origins of language and myth, and also kind of a cross-cultural comparison with anthropology and other things like that. When we talk about religion too, we always think that religion is strictly a human endeavor. It's something that humans do, right? Well, some argue that there are non-human, I don't mean inhuman, although that's certainly true. We've seen some inhuman religious practices, but there are non-human practices that look kind of religious, or at least spiritual, or at least aware of something beyond themselves. There are some traits that we can see in animals that are existing that would have been necessary in our lives or in our history for the development of religion. There's high intelligence. Okay, we know that primates show high intelligence, but they're not the only ones. You can watch dolphins, for example. You can watch elephants, and there is a high degree of intelligence there. There is great memory that's there. There's a sense of social norms that are there. There's a sense of self that we can see in some of them. It cracks me up to watch videos that people are taking of animals, and if there's anything that was a nice byproduct of this, as much as this drives me crazy sometimes, people wind up taking pictures of everything. For the love of God, they take a picture of the spaghetti that they're eating, and they put it on Facebook and want everybody to see it. Somebody posted a few years ago, and they said, hey, remember when I used to take Polaroids of the food I ate, and I took it around to your house and show it to you? Yeah, I never did that. Stop. So I kind of feel the same way. Okay, but one of the things we can see is people taking pictures of animals in zoos, animals in the wild even. And I saw this orangutan that was sitting there looking completely bored, poor thing. I mean, it just seems like, okay, it may be a cushy life where they're getting fed all the time, but how boring for an animal that's used to swinging in the trees in Borneo to now having to sit there watching humans stare back at them or make faces at them or tap the window or whatever. So, but this one orangutan is just sitting there looking. So a guy puts down 3 cups with a ball under one of the cups, and he shuffles it around and everything. And so the orangutan looks at it, and he picks up the cup, and there's nothing in it. He picks up the second cup and shows him. Picks up the other one, nothing there. And the orangutan laughs, grins really big, throws his head back, puts his hand on his forehead, and falls back. Just absolutely cracking up at this thing. And then you've seen the compassion. I just thought animals were always, out for number one. They're just going to take care of themselves, and the rest of the animals can take care of themselves. But I saw a duck go over to this fish food trough and get it in his beak, his bill, whatever you call it, and go over and dump it into the pond where the koi were. This duck was feeding the fish. And I'm like, I don't get that at all. I never heard of such a thing. But here's the thing I'm really talking about. When elephants have an elephant that dies, they will bury the elephant and they will stand around the grave and stand there for a long time in complete silence. And then they will trumpet and turn around and leave. That's a religious ceremony. Okay, call it what you want, a memorial or whatever like that, but they've got that kind of intelligence. Well, that's also representative of where we were hundreds of thousands of years ago. Among the Neanderthals, they have found in some of those caves in Germany burial sites where there were skeletons, but they would also find like cave paintings, which were supposed to be representative of something, but also bury them with other things like fish hooks. 35,000 BC, and they're burying them with fish hooks because apparently they're thinking that there's something beyond this life. And the one who has departed needs to have the equipment to go into the next life. And fish hooks was high up on the list. Here's the funny thing about that, is that the fish hook, which had been carved out of bone, looks exactly like the fish hook we use today. In 35,000 years, we have not changed the fish hook. Well, when you find what works, why reinvent it over and over, I guess. So there's, and obviously with them writing on the cave paintings, symbolism is starting to develop. They're starting to make connections between this thing that we're doing here and it representing something else. A lot of people want to say that's not enough. Maybe it's not, but it is certainly the beginning of what's going to take place in the humanoid or hominid, I guess is the word I want, hominid species. There are certain mechanisms that take place, and scientists pretty much agree with the idea that there is a disposition to engage in religious behavior kind of early on in human history, but there is a disagreement about exactly how that takes place. What was it that drove the religious mind? What was it that developed in us and developed in society that made, was it death? Was it dealing with death? That's a good start. That's a good place to start. There's actually two schools of thought. One is that religion itself developed thanks to natural selection. Well, that seems odd. Why would natural selection, in other words, the survival of the fittest, why would that have such an impact? It's because they say that the religious mind had some kind of an evolutionary advantage. Well, what in the world could that possibly be? What advantage? Well, before we get there, let's go to the second one. And that is that religious beliefs, religious behaviors, the idea of some kind of a deity may have emerged as byproducts of other traits that were in us without really being affected by a belief system. But then there's a third suggestion, actually, that with different aspects of religion, that they require different evolutionary explanations, and that they start showing up in what we now know about DNA. In DNA, for example, there's what's it called? The VTA2 gene, I think. The science calls it the God gene. And it is a gene that is in us that absolutely makes us predisposed towards the idea of something beyond ourselves, that makes us look towards something other than us being the source and the center of all existence. But when did all that happen? Well, there's sets of theories about the religious mind being a consequence of the development of the brain, a brain that's large enough to start creating religious thoughts and philosophical ideas. During the development of the human species, there wound up being this revolutionary moment about 500,000 years ago when the human brain, or even pre-human brain, but human brain, when it reached the size that pretty much we have now. It reached its optimum size. That growth peaked 500,000 years ago. And much of the development that was there at that point, this cerebral revolution, is, like I told you, in the third part of the brain, the third stage of the brain, the neocortex. The cerebral neocortex is responsible for computations in the brain, for even thinking, not just, moving beyond stuff like just instinct or just reaction or just fight or flight, like we used to say. It moves beyond that. You can actually develop thought. You can develop language thanks to the neocortex. We wind up having memories of episodes. Like if I say to you, hey, remember in Christmas of 1975? Oh, absolutely right. Oh, remember when that's called episodic memory. And that doesn't happen until we have the neocortex. That kind of episodic memory like that. So that's why it becomes important for us, because we can now say in our sacramental language, remember when you were baptized? Yeah, absolutely. You remember when you were when you took First Communion? Do you? Most of us don't remember when we were baptized because you're a little bit of baby. But for those who don't believe in infant baptism, or do you remember when you went through confirmation, or do you remember when all of those things that are important sacramentally isn't going to happen until we have this part of the brain develop. It develops social complexity, and the size of it also kind of correlates with the number of social variables that are possible, the different number of relationships you can have. Before, for example, when they talk about, back in those days, there wasn't any such thing as marriage. There wasn't such things as monogamy. You just, we were like animals. Well, once the neocortex comes along in our brains, now we have certain relationships, and they start to become ironclad. Family relationships, not just tribal, not just clan relationships, but family relationships. Husband and wife, spousal relationships. With children, or then even with religious groups, with educational units, with things like that. All of that starts to develop by this time. In chimpanzees, the neocortex is about 50% of their brain. In humans, it's 80% of our brain. The biggest part of our brain is the cerebral neocortex, which makes us so social, so linguistic, so everything you can think of, symbolic, religious. All of those things come from that, and it's developed that way in us because of this. A guy named Stephen Jay Gould, he's a writer of science, and he said that he believes that religion may have grown out of these evolutionary changes, which favors larger brains. So He says, look at the larger brained animals and watch their behavior. And he's exactly right. You start looking at those animals with the larger neocortex and with the cerebral neocortex. You start looking at them and you can see the behavior like the elephants, like the chimpanzees, like other animals like that show this kind of religious or spiritual behavior. But let's stay with religious. Well, of course, maybe after the development of the neocortex, the most important thing socially is the development of language. I mean, how are we going to talk about God without language? How are we going to talk about our beliefs without language? Language, that symbolic communication, is what's absolutely necessary for transmitting beliefs from one to another. I mean, think about if there's no language. Think about, we're sitting here and we can't talk and we can't even draw or write. We're just sitting here and I'm supposed to tell you what I believe about God. Well, we think, oh, well, we'll just make motion. We'll just go. That's still symbolic language because I don't know what that is. Look out, there's a bird coming and he looks like he's had a lot to eat. Or a pterodactyl or whatever. No, that's right. They don't exist at the same time. No, that's still symbolic language. How am I going to pass along what? And if I don't have any language, am I even really thinking? Well, of course, we can look at somebody like Helen Keller, who apparently didn't have language, and yet she had thought, but she learned sign language. So there was some kind of a symbolism going on in her brain. Okay, so we look at this whole, a guy named Philip Lieberman. He says, human religious thought and moral sense clearly rests on the language sense in a human being. Yeah, all right. Now, that seems kind of simple and kind of like, yeah, right. But it's not something we think about usually. So when we look at the development of language, we can see, looking forward ahead here, we can see the development in different kinds of religious thought and religious development. Well, the Greeks were really good at that. And of course, a lot of people want to say, well, why did Christianity ever have to go with the Greeks? Why couldn't it, I mean, our Hebrew thinking, the Hebrew language and all like that was so good. I've always thought that it took Greek in order to help Christianity really express itself. Because we'll take Hebrew, for example. There are two tenses in Hebrew. It's the perfect tense and the imperfect tense. Basically, the perfect tense means the thing is already done. The imperfect tense means the thing hasn't been completed yet. But that could mean, has it started and hasn't been completed? Hasn't even been started yet? Maybe it hasn't been started yet. There's all kinds of things to fill in. So when Luther was translating the Hebrew Bible, he was like, man, dealing with some of those verbs and the tenses of the verbs is pretty difficult. But in Greek, remember, Hebrew has 2, Greek has 16 different tenses. It is a precise language. And if nothing else, Hebrew gives us this tense called the aorist tense, which says it is a thing that has been done, it is completed, but it is continually being completed. And that's the tense that's being used to refer to our salvation. Our salvation has been achieved, and yet it is continually working in our life. That's fantastic. So thank God for Greek. A lot of people, one guy thought he was being clever, and he said, well, what the church needs to do is get the grease out of the church. And that's funny. Had it not been for that, our theology would be really skimpy, I'll say. So, Nicholas Wade says, like most behaviors that are found in societies throughout the world, religion must have been present in the ancestral human population before the dispersal from Africa 50,000 years ago. Although religious rituals involved usually dance and music, they're also very verbal, since the sacred truths have to be stated. And if so, religion, at least in its modern form, cannot predate the emergence of language. It's been argued that language attained its modern state shortly before the departure from Africa. If religion had to await the evolution of modern articulate language, then religion too would have emerged only as far back as 50,000 years ago. Well, think about 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, there were still no people populating the Americas. That didn't happen for, well, estimates have changed, and some have now said that it's not just 10,000 years ago, it looks more like 20,000 years ago. Think about that. The departure from Africa, when especially, East Africa? Yeah. Where the first humans are developing, they began to spread out from there. They go south down into Africa. They go across the desert. Actually, back then it wasn't even a desert. It was kind of a, well, never mind that. That's a whole other thing. They wound up crossing into the Middle East, what we should now call southwestern Asia. And then from there, they split apart again, and some of them went up into what today is Turkey, then up into Russia, and then Europe. Some of them went over into Central Asia. Some of them turned down and went into India. Some of them kept on going until they got to Japan, until they got to, and at that point, they could have made that because the water levels were lower, and so they could have walked across. Just like the Bering Strait Bridge, they could have walked across there. They've been finding evidence of human existence in the Americas 25,000 years ago. Pretty remarkable. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff, dinosaurs that they found and mastodons or mammoths, all that stuff. So, yeah, they were here a long time ago. Humans, not so much. Humans weren't even out of Africa until, again, 50,000 years ago. But here's a funny thing. So during this trek, we sometimes wonder, why is it that Asians have, I'm going to use a term that's really not good. We call it slant-eyed, right? Which is, it's not. Asian eyes aren't slanted at all. It's the same as ours. There's actually an extra fold of skin. That's what gives it that look, that, I don't know, everything I say sounds pretty racist and horrible, so forgive me, I'm going to say the squinty look, but it's not that. It's the fold of skin there. Of course, every time my Japanese friends, when they would make fun, they would go, hey, look, I'm an American. So, all right, it goes both ways. Yeah. But anyway, why was that necessary? Well, as they were going across Central Asia, there came kind of a flash ice age. And all of a sudden, these glaciers moved down now into Central Asia, and these people who were there, still evolving, the ones who had that extra fold of skin, that actually helped cut the glare of the sun coming off the ice. That meant that they were better able to hunt, they were better able to see predators at a distance because they weren't suffering the snow blindness like Western eyes. I was thinking of round-eyed and everything. It just sounds terrible. So in that short period of time, thanks to natural selection, those people with the extra fold of skin, they were the ones who procreated, they were the ones who lived, and now we have a whole culture of people who look like that. It's the same thing as, why are the Scandinavians fair-skinned and blonde-haired and all like that? Well, because where they are in the snow and the ice and the cold and all like that, they didn't need the extra melanin in their skin, but those in Africa or in India or in Central and South America, because of the exposure to the sun, absolutely had to have it. And so those who had that in their DNA, natural selection allowed them to continue on like that. Okay, so here we are, heading out of there now, moving out after the 50,000 years ago, began scattering all over the place. And one of the things that is also looked at is the difference between individual religious belief and collective religious belief. While individual religious belief doesn't really require language because it's my religious belief, and I'm not trying to evangelize with anybody, collective religious belief does require that kind of language. So maybe individual religious belief existed long before. We just weren't sharing it. We weren't evangelizing it, as they like to say. So that's also something that may be stuck way inside some of our DNA, is that there are those who feel more comfortable with individual religious belief than they do in participating in collective belief. And there are those who participate in collective belief who wind up saying, this is terrible. We're being corralled here. We're being treated like a lump of humanity just going to hell. I mean, this collective idea is terrible. And so they say, we should leave that. We should do something else. First, we'll try to change it. But if that doesn't work, so if we can look at the individual self, of course you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Martin Luther. Martin Luther goes, we're not all a lump of sin. No, we're each. Of course, he was a child of the Renaissance too. And so he was saying, look, each of us have value. Each of us is loved completely by God. And so his individuation led to this breaking away for him. Of course, once everybody realized that was okay, well, then everybody started breaking away. Then came Zwingli, then came John Calvin, then came the Anabaptists, then came, and then on and on and on. Which is why Luther has been called the best thing that happened to the church and the worst thing. Because it was like breaking a windshield. Once the crack's there, it starts to scatter all over the place. Well, so we wind up then watching the development of language and watching how it starts allowing ideas to be presented. And we wind up then having this disagreement about how religion really develops. Is it something that is good for us and allows us to feel good and allows us to have this sense of well-being, and that is what gets passed on? Or is it the idea of belonging to something bigger than ourselves? And religious scholars are still arguing about that. And I suppose they're both right to some degree. For example, when we go back to that VMAT2 gene, that gene there is what predisposes us towards spirituality, and it is what has been passed on inside each and every one of us now. Spirituality is genetic in the human species now. And it may take different forms, and it may take forms that we don't even like or agree with. It may take forms that, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, sometimes the religion in another person looks very unreligious to me. And yet, it's what they need. It's what's good for them. But symbolism, first with language and then going on, is what helps to establish the belief patterns. It's what helps to establish, rituals and even collectives, religious groups, that because of those symbols then, not just language, not just writing, not just a cave painting, but we start to develop symbols that are concrete. And those symbols become very important to us as we go along. Let's use our own religion. In Christianity, think about holy water. That's a symbol. It's a concrete symbol. Think about the Chi-Rho, those two Greek letters that symbolized, Christianity in its, I was going to say in its industrial form, but okay, corporate form. Of course, the easiest one to figure out is the cross. The cross is a symbol of sacrifice, a symbol of suffering, but ultimately a symbol of victory, a symbol of salvation, which is a thing also holding in tension those two opposite things, utter defeat and complete victory, is something that a highly developed mind can only do. I'm going to say a highly developed brain, because, mind implies wisdom, and that's not always found. So we have these things that develop in us, but you look back at some of the earlier religions. Hinduism predates Christianity by 4,000 years maybe, and there's simple things like rocks shaped in certain ways, or there are certain mountains that in Japan, in Japanese religion, there are certain symbols that mountains form that is religious to them. Even mountains themselves. A guy named Rudolf Otto wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy. And he said that we have this idea of, he calls it the numinous. It means something awesome. He said, think about the feeling that you get when you're looking up at this incredible mountain. If you've ever been to Pikes Peak, for example, and you're coming up on these plains through Kansas and Nebraska, and you start seeing this mountain rise up, it's awesome. Or even where I used to live in Portland, that on a clear day and you would see Mount Hood there, you just get this feeling from this mountain. And he says, and that's kind of what we try to recreate in our own temples and shrines, is this idea of space and vastness, which is why the churches of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were these soaring spires, because it's something bigger than us. An ocean is bigger than us. We look at the ocean and we think about its depth and we think about its breadth. And we, first time my dad and I took him to the Pacific Ocean. And we were standing there looking at it, and I said, funny, doesn't look any bigger than the Atlantic. And he just kind of looked at me like I was an idiot. But even the ocean or something like that, or wind, or something that is beyond ourselves, those become symbols for us too. And we think about reading in our own scriptures about the use of nature when it talks about the power of the earthquake, or that God holds the 7 stars in his hands, or any of those things like that, are things that are huge and things that take us beyond ourselves. Those symbols become the earliest things. So the earliest forms of religion that we're going to have are going to be nature religions. The earliest things that we try to explain are things that occur in nature, like the rising and falling of the sea, tidal waves, storms, earthquakes, volcanoes. And so we start trying to attach symbols to them. We hear thunder, and if we're living in Norway, we think, must be Thor. If we're on a boat in the Mediterranean Sea or in the Aegean Sea and the waves are tossing us, must be Poseidon, pretty upset with us. But they wind up having these kind of symbols attaching first to natural phenomena. It becomes very important for us in the development. In fact, even in Judaism, God, in God's earliest views, is a God of storms. We think about Yahweh as being the God who is the one God and all like that. Well, first off, we kind of have to clear that up, that we think about Judaism being monotheistic, believing in one God. It's actually not. It's actually, the word is henotheistic. It means we know there are other gods, but we have chosen this one God. That's why the commandment said, "You shall have no other gods before me." It's acknowledging other gods, but Yahweh is saying, I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear about your other gods. I know they're there, but we're not going to talk. Now that will wind up developing a way too, so that Judaism will become a monotheistic religion and will say, and we always want to go, but wait a minute, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." Yeah, that was added much later. That was looking back at it at a time when now they think that way, but before they were acknowledging other gods. Well, here's the thing, and I probably told you this before, but in Hinduism, for example, they say they have 33 million gods, right? No, because I think I told you, I asked a Hindu scholar one time, I said, 33 million, do you have a day like All Saints Day where you got to pray to all 33 million? And he was like, no, we don't believe in 33 million. Sure you do. I can name off a handful of them. No. He said, it's all one God. We believe that all these 33 million are 33 million revelations of who the one God really is. Oh. And he goes, yeah, see, you only have a Trinity. We got a Trinity times 11 million. I'll think you all stay with ours. But when we think about that, and when they say, oh yeah, sure, when we think about Krishna is this energetic, young, playing a flute, so happy, brings joy every place. And then you've got the other side of God that kind of wrecks stuff for you. And so we talk about Shiva, who will destroy things. Or we talk about Kali, his consort, who, yeah, she kind of puts up with him because, after all, he's a guy. But then she's the one who rebuilds. She's the one who brings the family together. And he says, all of those are simply telling us that God is so amazing, it takes 33 million descriptions. Okay, I can buy that. I like that. Even in Christianity, there are times when we will use certain words. I was talking with a guy just the other day, and he said, yep, you know what? I just really needed a comforter, and I went to God for the comfort. And I'm like, right. That's what the Holy Spirit said. He goes, yeah, but it's not just that. Sometimes I want to talk to God as a teacher. Sometimes I want to talk to God as a parent. Sometimes I want to talk to God as just a close friend. Sometimes I want... All those things are absolutely right. And even St. Augustine described that as saying, you know what? I may be Aurelius Augustinus, and I may be a father to my son, and a son to my mother, and a best friend to my best friend, but I still remain Aurelius Augustinus. All of that requires language. All of that requires a use of symbolism too. But then things really got to take off when we developed writing. And writing now, because beforehand, it's got to be what we call personal evangelism. I have to tell you about what I believe. But now with writing, I can write these things down or chisel them in clay or use the sticks to make impressions in mud bricks. We can use ink on scrolls. We can do all these things. And now the word of our religion can spread to places that we may never go. The scroll or the tablet may go there, or copies of it may go there. So writing becomes really important. And imagine where we would be if we didn't have writing. There would be no Bible. There would be no Tibetan Book of the Dead. There would be no Quran. There would be none of those things that we have now. I admit, there are times when I think we might have been better off without this. But that's just on my worst days. So writing, it shows up about 5,000 years ago. And there are symbols that we'll see written on places, but as far as actual writing, we're not going to see it until the Sumerians are probably the first. Some want to say the Egyptians, some say the Sumerians, but since I'm the one talking, I'm going to tell you I think it's the Sumerians. And they're the ones who write with the reeds mashing into the mud tablets, and then they would let them dry. The language is simple because it's just using these little things. I brought along and showed it to you. The symbols themselves are simple, but they wind up having a rather complex vocabulary. And it's funny what the language of the Sumerians will tell us, for example. I was teaching a class on ancient Mesopotamia, and so I gave them a glossary of the Akkadian language. And I said, okay, tell me what you can figure out just from this glossary. Take it home. When I see you next week, tell me what you can figure out. And they were exactly right. They came back and they said, must have been a swampy place. Absolutely. It was absolutely swampy along the banks of the Euphrates. What else you got? Well, there's at least 6 different words for rushes, bulrushes. And they must have really hated people and been really warlike, because there's about 12 words for war. There's at least 3 for spear. And I'm like, you're getting all of it right. All of that exactly describes the Akkadians. The first conqueror that we have in history is a guy named Sargon I, who was a conqueror from Akkad. Anyway, so beforehand, we had what was called the oral tradition, where things were passed along by storytelling. That still exists, and it's pretty fascinating. A friend of mine, or a couple of friends of mine, they were from Iceland, and there was actually a community of Icelanders in Nashville, where I was going to grad school, and they said, come along with us. We want you to hear the sagas being sung. What? So I went along, and so, of course, I didn't know Icelandic, but you could hear, and there was a few words that I could pick up along the way, but these guys would actually sing like Egil's saga or the Orkneyinga saga or something like that. Things that were important to Icelandic belief, Scandinavian belief, but they would sing this whole thing. Well, that's actually how the Iliad and the Odyssey were first done, which is why you see certain phrases in there that get repeated over and over again, because it's like a chorus in a song. And it helps you to, let me get back, now the next verse. And you go on. And these guys would wind up training each other generation after generation after generation. And in many ways, it was even more precise than written language was. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to copy down a document, but sometimes at least for me, I have a hard time looking at a thing and then looking away and going back. So if I'm trying to copy this, I might, okay, you're right there. But when my eye goes back, I might miss a line. I might skip down. I might miss a word, especially if this line starts off with in the beginning, and then the second line starts off with in the beginning. Well, then I might look back and see the in the beginning, but I'm on the wrong line. And a lot of things get left out that way. There are so many things, even in our biblical texts, but it ain't just us. It's happened to all the religions, that the copying that went on sometimes left out the important phrases. And then sometimes they would, like in Greek, for example, there's really no punctuation. And you look at some of the ancient manuscripts, And you can't even tell when one word has ended and the other has begun because they're trying to save space on this scroll because it's expensive, and so is the ink expensive. And so they wind up, and you're like, okay, does the word end here or does it start here? And it changes the meaning of everything. Now, it doesn't happen a lot. Don't let me scare you about, the New Testament being inaccurate. It's not. The New Testament is marvelously well preserved. But there are a few things. And there were some things that actually got added at a later point, like when Jesus is talking about remember the boy with epilepsy, and the disciples come back and, we can't get that. And it says, Jesus responds to him and said, these things only come out by prayer and fasting. Remember? Well, no. That's not what the original said. In fact, fasting was not included in most of the scripts. But somebody along the way started inserting and fasting. Well, who would do such a thing? Maybe it was those professional religious folks, the monks, who were doing the transcribing in the first place. And who does fasting look good on? Well, them, because they're doing fasting all the time. So this is kind of their way of puffing themselves up. We look at another document that was found in the 1950s. And the disciples asked Jesus, so when are you going to fast? And Jesus said, what sin have I done? Oh, all right. There's the answer. Fasting in the time of Jesus was penance. It was for subjugating yourself because of sins that you have done. Jesus was saying, I don't have to fast. I ain't sinned. Pass the chocolate cake. So, with writing, everything starts to take a really nice turn now. So we wind up then starting to see in these, in writing, we start seeing mythologies being put down, ancient stories. One of the first, and maybe my favorite of the ancient world, was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in Gilgamesh, oh man, what a story that is. It's a story about a guy who is a king. He's a great king, but he is a jackass. He is not a nice man. He's definitely lost control of himself. And so the gods always are like, we got to do something to fix this. This he's too full of himself. So they send a friend to him, and this friend begins to show him what friendship is like and show him what. And Gilgamesh goes off on these travels, and he meets a guy named Utnapishti who says, oh yeah, I survived the great flood. Really, what'd you do? Well, I built this. I was told that this flood was coming, and so I built this boat. And on this boat, I took different kinds of all the animals. And it sounds familiar. And this was written maybe 1,500, 2,000 years before the writing of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis. So we start seeing ideas like that being now passed from place to place. Certain stories have influences on other places, on religious ideas, as a matter of fact, on various, we see a lot of crossover between cultures and religions, and that's not a bad thing, because in the ancient world, it was okay, like for example, in our book of Proverbs, and we think, oh, this is always the great wisdom of the ancient Hebrew people. Well, sort of, because there's also a complete portion of the book of Proverbs that is taken from the Egyptian book called the Wisdom of Anamimepe. But that wasn't stealing. It wasn't copying. Because the Hebrews looked at it and said, this is wise. These are wise sayings. And wisdom was wisdom no matter where it came from. These days, we're much more narrow-minded than that. Oh, for crying out loud. We got into the Middle Ages and we wound up having the bubonic plague and it swept across Europe, and they found out, hey, these Arab doctors have figured out a treatment for it. And the Pope said, but they're Muslims. We can't use that. Okay. So, a quarter of Europe, some say a third of Europe, died thanks to the bubonic plague because we wouldn't use a thing that a Muslim had found. Oh, that's great. But wisdom is wisdom. And if it's given to us by God, then God wants all of us to have it and use it. Well, we wind up then developing, because of these ancient legends, we start developing mythology. And mythology refers to a system of legends or myths or the study of myths. And the word myth isn't a bad word. We always get really itchy when we start talking about Christian myths. It's not a myth, it's true. Yeah, we didn't say it wasn't. There are certain myths that are true. There are certain myths. Myth doesn't mean fiction. It means it's something that has entered into a cultural consciousness that carries great, deep symbolism for us. Now, Merriam-Webster says a myth is usually traditional story of what may be historical events that serves to unfold a part of a worldview or of a people and to explain a practice, a belief, or a natural phenomenon. Well, okay, this is what myth does, is it explains our beliefs. A guy named Robert Graves, who wrote this terrific book in 1968 about the Greek myths, he said that myths are whatever religious or heroic legends that are so foreign to our experience that we cannot believe them to be true. Story of Noah, story of Moses, the story of take any of those things. Oh, for crying out loud, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. You know, I was so disgusted when I found out that never really happened. Well, wait a minute. He said I could not tell a lie, and now we're lying about him telling that we couldn't tell a lie. No. And then my dad, God bless him, said, no, this is a myth. This is a story that's used to explain something deeper than the thing itself. Okay, so what's he explaining? It's explaining what an honest man George Washington was. All right, what about throwing $1 across the Potomac River? And he was like, I don't know about that. I don't know what that means, you know. Because at the time I was thinking, what do you do? Fold it up into a paper airplane? You know, no, his dollar was a coin, you know. Oh, maybe he skipped it across the Potomac River. Anyway, I don't know what all that means. So sometimes myths are used for secular purposes. Sometimes there are overnight myths. I'll give you one. You remember the tragedy of the Columbine High School shooting, right? When those two boys went in there and gunned down, I don't remember what the number was, so many people. All right, so there was a girl named Cassie Bernal. And the story came out that one of the gunmen came up to her and said, do you believe in God? And she goes, yes, I do. And he shot her. Yeah, that's not what happened. What happened was he walked up to a girl named Rachel Schnurr and said, do you believe in God? And she said, yes, I do. And he turned around and walked away. That's a better story. But the parents of Cassie Bernal wrote a book called She Said Yes. And they perpetuated this myth. And I'm telling you, it was overnight that this myth took hold. Well, Rachel Schnurr, she kept it quiet. She was a good girl. She didn't say anything about it. But there were other students who were there, and they were like, no, that's not what happened. And even when the parents were told about it, and they were like, yeah, but it's a story that tells about her faith, and it's a story about her. It's a lie. So, there are some myths that reveal truth. There are some myths that are based on a lie. Well, we look at even our stories in Christianity, and we can talk about the feeding of the 5,000. We can talk about, and then so many myths develop after the New Testament age, when there are so many great stories, and Lord knows I want them to be true. When Polycarp is being tied at the stake, and they're going to burn him, and they said, you need to point to all these Christians and say, away with these atheists. And Polycarp looks at all the Romans and goes, away with these atheists. And they were like, what? Well, set him on fire. Well, they start to burn him, and Polycarp becomes provocative and says, who are you going to burn with this? This ain't enough fire to burn anybody. You need to throw on some more sticks here. When they get mad, well, what Polycarp knew is that with a lot of fire, you die from, well, they call it smoke inhalation, but it's asphyxiation. All the oxygen has been, you don't die from the burning. That comes after you're already gone. So he's provoking them to do that. And then one of the Romans got so upset, he threw a spear at him, and it says it hit him in the side, and the water that rushed out actually extinguished the fire around him. All right, it's probably not true, but I want it to be so bad. And it's a great myth because the truth it reveals was the strength and the belief of Polycarp. Okay, there you go. That's a good story. Anyway, we've got loads of those things like that. Myths are powerful stories. They're great. They're tradition. And a lot of times we get hung up on the word myth, but it's not a bad word. Well, one of my favorite myth writers is, he was also a Christian, and he has written some great myths. Okay, it's fiction literature. Okay, it's fantasy literature. But J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, was actually a great scholar. And he loved the myths of the Middle Ages, and he would translate the stuff from Icelandic. He would translate some of the Old English and Middle English stories of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or Beowulf, things like that. Things that had become myths, or epics, as someone were called. He was a devout Catholic, but he loved myths, and he started saying that a myth is an echo of the truth. He wrote extensively on this. He said that myths held fundamental things, he called them. He said in a poem called Mythopoeia that, and he wrote this around 1931. He was still a relatively young man at that point. He talks about myth making is an act of, he called it subcreation, that we are acting like God or trying to imitate God, whereas God creates the universe, the cosmos, everything else. And so we create myths in imitation of that. All right. And his idea was actually adopted by another Christian writer named C.S. Lewis. They had great conversations about this, and Lewis said that Tolkien had explained to him that the story of Christ was a true myth. And for Lewis, that was incredibly important, that he started to realize that there were myths that were based on nothing. Think about the Cassie Bernal story. There were myths that were based on what ifs, but then there were myths that were based around actual true stories, true events. One of my favorite quotes from that is, there was a book called Arthur Rex by a guy named Thomas Berger. It's about King Arthur. All right, so we know that King Arthur, there was probably a guy that inspired this story, but there wasn't really a King Arthur. But at the end of his book, Thomas Berger says, and though he never existed, everything he did was true. Oh, what a great line. That is so, because he's saying that this is a myth that speaks of the truth, not historical accuracy, but this is what it means to be a true person, to be a person who's guided by God, a person who is devout, a person who is loyal to his friends. Everything he did was true. Well, so C.S. Lewis, he writes in his book, what was it called? Mere Christianity, I think. He says, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference. It really happened. And one must be content to accept it in that same way, remembering that it is God's myth, where the others are human myths. The pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images that he found there, while Christianity is God presenting God's self through what we call real things. Well, the whole idea then is that religion becomes, I want to say, the child of myth, of mythology. Because the mythology begins, like I said, with trying to explain how in the world we got here, explain the things that are happening in the world, the storms, the thunder, all that stuff. What will then soon develop is these myths will begin to start taking shape. The writings, whatever writings we're talking about, the Upanishads of Hinduism, the Quran of Islam, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, all of the rest of them will begin taking shape, and then we start seeing editing takes place, and now we really have religion as organization and institution. Even these days, we'll see certain neo-pagan groups who will freely use myths and will describe their stories of myth. There's a modern day kind of a revival of Germanic paganism called Astartu. Started in Germany, and not Astartu, Asartu. Starts in Germany, and they have claimed those sagas that I was talking about, the Orkney Inga, the Edda sagas, all these sorts North sagas. They have started to say that these are also inspired by God and were sent to the people of the North. Well, okay, you can make that argument. And who knows? God in God's wisdom can do anything God chooses to do, and we'll find out later. Anyway, so this is where we wanted to start. Sorry, did I take a long time? Oh, all right. We had to wait for our brains to develop before we could become religious. Some folks have become religious and still don't use much of their brains. I had a guy tell me one time when a pastor had been talking about one thing, and I'm like, come on. And so I was talking with him later. We had gone out for coffee, and he goes, Travis, can you just check your brain at the door, please? And I'm like, oh, man, you don't know me at all, do you? Holy smokes. Who wants to believe like that? Okay. So, thank goodness the language came along. The neocortex, cerebral neocortex was the last thing we were waiting for. And then it's kind of a slow process to get to where we can call it religion. But goodness, once we get it, it takes off. And now we've got more religions than you can shake a stick at, as my dad used to say. It still says, actually. So this is where we'll pause. If you have any questions, you can ask.
Before I'm going to stop the recording, where we're headed next week? Or
next time? Well, I figure we should go to I'm going to try to do it chronologically. That's the word. So then I need to ask, do we want to just look at the 5 major religions? That would be Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Or do you want to have, we can add another section where we talk about Sikhs and Jains and stuff like that. Or we can look at some of the mythological, like Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, Norse mythology, stuff like that. That's kind of fun, especially if you're going to watch like the Thor movies. Then you need to get some of that stuff. But so it's up to you. Do you want to do the major 5, or do you want to do a few extras? Well, like for example, in Milwaukee, we have a large Sikh community. Yeah. Sikh, actually, is what I'd always said Sikh, and I found out they're called Sikhs.
Well, I think, more. We could start with the main 5.
Okay.
And then add on from there. Would that be?
Then the first one we should do would be Hinduism. It actually does kind of predate Judaism by a good bit, really. But in fact, so it would be Judaism, Hinduism, then Judaism, then Buddhism, then Christianity, then Islam. And really the Sikhs and the Jains, they come around the same time as Islam does. But yeah. So I'm going to tell you everything. I won't spare your feelings. Like I just told you a minute ago that God had a wife named Asherah, but that got done away with too. But then in Judaism, it winds up coming back in the Middle Ages with this group known as, there had a text called the Kabbalah. And in the Kabbalah, you not only got Asherah, oh boy, you got a whole bunch of there's a bunch of skanky women in that text.
All right.
But